Hello everybody and welcome to my Spring Boot tutorial where I'm going to show you how to connect a PostgreSQL database to your Spring Boot project. So before we start, we're first going to create an empty Spring Boot project, and we're going to do that by using the Spring Initializer. So in order to use this web application, you have to visit this URL here, start.spring.io. And this is going to allow us to generate an empty Spring Boot project. So we're going to leave the most of the default settings. So we're going to leave the project type as Maven, the language is Java, the version is 2.4.4. Now, if you're watching this in the future, the latest stable version might be different, but just choose the default selected one and it should be completely fine. Then we're going to leave the group as com.example, but we're going to change the name here. I'm going to say PostgreSQL. And I'm going to change the description here. I'm going to say connect a PostgreSQL database with Spring Boot. The packaging, we're going to leave it as jar. Also, the Java version, I'm going to leave it as 11 because that's what I have installed on my machine. If you have installed Java 8, you should choose Java 8. If you have installed Java 16, you should choose Java 16. So which Java you have installed on your machine, that's the one you should choose here. I'm going to choose 11 because that's what I have installed. And now we have to choose the dependencies. So we're going to need a couple of dependencies. The first one that we're going to need is going to be Spring Web. And then we're going to need two dependencies that are going to help us to communicate with the database. One of them is the data JPA. And another one is the PostgreSQL driver. So this is the PostgreSQL driver. And now we're done with our project. We have the dependencies, we have the setup. We can click generate. After we click generate, we can save the zip file. And then we just have to extract the zip file and open it with IntelliJ. I'm going to be using IntelliJ, and I suggest that you use IntelliJ also. And after we open it in IntelliJ, we're going to get an empty Spring Boot project with obviously with no classes and anything. There's just going to be the entry point of the application, the main class, but there's not going to be other like resources and other things. So we're getting the main class and that's it. But before we go further, we first need to have a PostgreSQL database on our machine. Now you can install the PostgreSQL database. There's different ways of installing a PostgreSQL database. You can install it via the default installer. So you can visit their website and you can see the instructions for your operating system. I'm going to be using Docker in order to run my PostgreSQL database. So if you have installed Docker on your machine, I'm going to show you how you can very easily, in just one command, start the database. So if you have installed Docker on your machine, you can do docker pull Postgres, and after you do this, an image is going to get pulled to your machine, the Postgres image, and then after that's complete, then you can use this following command that I'm going to show you, and I'm actually going to execute. So I'm going to paste it here, but I'm just going to make it so it doesn't execute right away. So this is the command that's going to allow us to create a brand new database, sudo to run it as a root, and then we're going to do docker run. This is where we specify the name of the database. Actually, this is not the name of the database, this is the name of the container in Docker. Then we're going to map the port 5432 to the port 5432 on our local machine, and then we just specify Postgres user, and that's going to be Postgres password, that's going to be Postgres, and the database name is going to be Postgres. And this is going to create a brand new database with those parameters. So I'm going to click enter, and it's going to ask us for my root password, so I just have to enter my root password. After I enter my root password, okay, I messed up my password there. Now it should be fine. Let's see. And I guess it's fine. So now it's going to create the DB. And there we go. So now our DB is running in the background. And we can use the DB with these credentials here. Okay. Now, since we have the database ready, now we can move into the Spring application and we can connect it to that database. Now, in order to connect it to the database, what we have to do is we have to edit the application.properties file that's found here. So you have to go to source to main, and then there's going to be a resources directory by default. And then you're going to see an application.properties file right here. This is where we specify different various Spring Boot properties that we want to use. And this is where we're going to specify the connection string to our database. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say the data source URL of the application, so the data source URL. So I'm going to do spring.datasource.url, and that's going to be equal to JDBC, PostgreSQL, and now if the database is on your local host, this is where you're going to say localhost, and then because we mapped the port 5432 to our local 5432 port, so we can use that port, and the database name was Postgres, so we have to do /Postgres. So this is our database name here. Then we have to specify the username, so I'm going to do spring.datasource.username, and I'm going to say Postgres, because that's the username that we supplied here, right here. And we're going to have to do the same for the password, so I'm going to copy this line. I'm going to change this to be password. And the password also was Postgres. Now we have to specify some little different settings that I'm going to copy and paste here, and I'm going to explain what are they doing. So I'll copy them right now, I'll paste them here. So I'm going to explain what's happening. So this is the connection timeout here. This is after how much time the connection should time out. Then this is the maximum pool size. This is the maximum connections, simultaneous connections to the database that we want to create, that we want Spring to create, and that will be 5. We can obviously change these numbers, but I'm gonna leave them as they are right now. Then here we have the Spring JPA. We have the Spring JPA properties dialect. So this is an important one, and the dialect is actually which dialect of SQL we would like to use, because Hibernate is going to be generating automatic queries to the database, and we would like to use the PostgreSQL dialect. So that's going to be this line here, and then this down here. This is the DDL auto. If it's an update, it means that it's gonna update the database on changes. So if we change the model, and if we connect to the database, it's gonna see that there's a change in the model, and it's gonna run an update to the database. And this one here on line 12 is actually pretty important. This one says that we're gonna be logging all of the SQL in the console, and that can come pretty helpful, and we can see actually what's happening in the background. So that's gonna be pretty useful. We're gonna check that out later. So this is our setup. This is the most important one: the connection string, the password, and the username. And these are additional setup that we have to do here in order to configure some things. But that's going to be all the setup that we need. Now we should be capable of connecting to the database. So what I will do is I will actually run the application, and I will see if it works. And it should work. So let me run it. And if everything is right, it should work and it should start. And if it starts, that's a good sign, obviously. And while it's starting, what are we going to be creating right now? We're going to create a simple model. So we're going to create a simple model, and we're going to create a JPA repository for that model, and we're going to try to fetch it as a JSON. So that's what we're going to do, and that's going to be the goal for this video, just to show a very simple example of how to connect a PostgreSQL database. Now, before we continue, I am going to be using another software, and that's going to be a database manager. I'm going to be using DBeaver. DBeaver is a free database manager that you can download, and we're going to be using this database manager to fill the database with data, so that we can then fetch it with our Spring Boot application. So I guess the application is running, and I guess we don't have an error, so I guess that's fine, and we can continue with the tutorial, and we can create our model. So I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to continue with the model. So I'm going to create a package here, and I'm going to call it a model. That's where we usually place our model scene. So I'm going to create a model package, and in here I'm just going to create one very simple model, nothing really special, and I'm going to name it. Okay, so let me first close that. So I'm going to create one model, and the model name is going to be, let's say, product. Let's create a product table. I'm going to call it product. And that's going to create a Java class. Now, in order for this class to become an actual database table, what we have to do is we have to specify an annotation here, and the annotation is entity. That's how we're gonna tell Spring that this is an actual entity in the database. So you have to import entity from the JavaX persistence API. Then what we have to do, then we can specify our properties. The first one, and the very obvious one, that every table should have its own ID. So I'll specify an ID here with the annotation ID, and I'll say that the generation type it's going to be a generated value, and with a strategy. So the generation strategy is going to be generation type auto. So that's going to be an auto incremental generation of the ID. And then I'm going to say private, not like that, but private long ID. And that's going to be our ID. Then for each product we're going to have, let's have a private string name. Let's have a private string description. And I guess that's going to be fine. Yeah, I guess that's going to be fine. So let's keep it simple. Let's actually let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple with just these three variables. And then I'm going to, so now in order for this to actually work, each entity needs to have the default constructor, and it needs to have getter and setter methods. So yeah, an easy way to generate that in IntelliJ is by doing alt insert, and when you do alt insert, you're gonna get presented with this menu. Also, you can reach the same menu by doing the right click and generate. But I'm gonna be using alt insert, and I'm gonna create a constructor, an empty constructor, and I'm gonna create a constructor with all parameters, and I'm gonna create getter and setter methods for all our properties. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to create getter and setter methods for all our properties. After we have done this, our database entity is ready. So yeah, it's definitely ready. And now we can go and actually do our repository layer. So this is the entity. This is going to get created into the database. But now let's create another package. Let's create a repository for this entity. So I'm going to create a package. I'm going to name it repository. And in this package, I'm going to create a product repository. And this one's going to be an interface. I'm going to tell you why. So in order to create a repository, or in order to use the model or the entity, we can do that very easily by using something called a JPA repository. So a JPA repository is an already defined API in the data JPA, and we can use that one we can use an already default methods of repositories in order to query our model and our database. So in order to use the JPA repository, we have to create an interface, and then we have to extend the JPA repository. And then we just have to configure two things here. So the first thing is we want to say which type of data we're storing in this JPA repository. And in this case, we are storing a product. So I have to do product. And there we go. We just have to import that. And then out of which type is the ID. So what's the type of the ID? And I'm going to say it's going to be a long. And that's all we need. That's our repository. So we just have to extend this JPA repository. This already comes with predefined methods like find all, delete, and find by ID, and things like that. So all we need to do is we need to do this. Now, this already is annotated with a repository. You don't have to do here, but for the demonstration purposes, I will add the repository annotation here. But you don't have to add it because in the JPA repository, it's already added. Now if I go down the classes, you're gonna see that it's gonna be no repository bin, but if you go to CRUD repository, and like that, if you go to the classes, they extend the native repository, and then the interfaces are implemented in the CRUD repository, and then we have a paging and sorting repository, and then we are getting the JPA repository, which is the on the top of each of these repositories. And that's the suggestion. The suggestion is that we use the JPA repository because it has most of the features of these all other repositories. but we could have been using some of these others, like the paging and sorting repository, the CRUD repository. We could use those, but for this demonstration, we're going to use the JPA repository. So a bin will be created out of our repository when the Spring Boot application starts, and we are gonna be able to inject it into our services, into our controllers, and all of those things. So now what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna create a testing controller where we're gonna test this JPA repository. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna say new package, and I'm gonna name it controller. And in this package, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new class, and the class is gonna be product controller. I'm gonna say this is gonna be a REST controller, and REST controller means we can build RESTful services with REST controllers and return JSON and get JSON, and then I'm gonna map this controller to, let's say, product. Okay, so that's gonna be fine. I'm gonna map it to product. And now, in order to use our JPA repository, we have to inject it. In order to inject it, we first have to put a field for our bin that we want to accept the bin or the object that we want to inject, and that's going to be out of type product repository. Oops, there we go. And now, as you can see, Spring Boot is going to say that this has not been initialized, and it's going to help us if we do Alt and Enter. So if you click Alt and Enter, it's going to say add a constructor parameter, and that's exactly what we want to do. So that's what I'm going to do. What this is going to do here, this is going to inject the object created when the Spring starts. So there's going to be a bin created out of this class, an implementation of this class. There's going to be a bin created, and it's going to get injected right here, and we're going to be able to use it in the product controller. So this repository will be injected in here by using the constructor-based dependency injection. And then we can specify a get mapping here. So I'm going to specify get mapping, and I'm going to say that we're going to return a public response entity. We're going to return a response entity, and we're going to say get all products. And what I'm going to return, I'm just going to return this .product repository .find all. And then this is obviously not going to work because we have to actually wrap it in a response entity. So response entity dot, I'm going to say .ok, because this will be like an OK response, like a 200 OK response. And this should return all of our products. So it should get them from the database and return them in a JSON format. So now I'm going to run the application right now. I'm going to click run. And when we reach this URL, the /product, we should actually not get any products because the database is empty, and we should get an empty array. Probably that's what we're going to get. So I'm going to do exactly that right now. I'm going to wait for this to start. And I'm going to wait for that to start, and while that's starting, I'm just gonna I'm gonna get this URL ready, and it's gonna be right here. So I have the URL ready. I'm waiting for the application to start, and I guess it's about to start right now. And I guess we are about ready right now. Let me see. And as you can see, this is what I was talking about. So this is the show SQL feature that we used. And actually what's happening, as you can see, the Hibernate is actually showing the queries that are getting ran into the database. So as you can see, there's a create table product with the ID, with the description, with the name and the primary key. And also we're creating the Hibernate sequence for the ID because we chose generation type auto. So this is what this is the setting that we use here. And we said that we want to show the SQL that's getting ran to the database. And that's, if you enable this, you're going to get the SQL right here. So that's pretty nice, for debugging reasons, or just to see the SQL. But let's go into the browser right now. Let's go into the browser and let's try to reach this route product and see what's going to happen. So we send a GET request, and as you can see, we got an empty array here. Now, we're getting an empty array because the database is empty. So let's fill the database with some data. In order to fill the database with data, I will use the DBeaver database manager. And now, when you install DBeaver, in order to add a connection, so we're going to connect to the same database that our Spring Boot application is connected. In order to add a connection, you have to click this plus icon here, and then you can choose the PostgreSQL database here, right here. Then you click next. Now, if you're installing it for the first time, it might ask you that it's going to download the driver for Postgres. So you just have to click yes to that. And then we just have to configure the same credentials. So the database was Postgres, the username was Postgres, our password was Postgres also. And then first click test connection to test the connection and see if it works. And the connection is successful. And then if everything went all right, we can click finish. Now, after we click finish, we're going to get our database here. Then we can click this. This is our database Postgres. We can go to schemas, to public, and in public, in tables, we have our product table that Spring automatically generated for us. Now, what I can do here is I can create a query here for this database. So I can open the SQL editor here on the right, and I can first say select star from product. And if I run this, by the way, how do you run here? You run the code. I can just zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better. But how do you actually run in here? How do you run the code? So you run the code with Control and Enter. So if I do Control and Enter, that's going to run the code, and we are getting an empty database, as you can see. So that's why we're also getting an empty array here. Now let's put some data inside the database, and let's try that. So let's put some data inside the database. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little better what I'm doing. Now we can do that by using the insert statement. So I'm going to insert into. I'm going to insert some data in the database. Now, in order to insert data, we're going to be insert into product. So let me just do that, and I'm going to say that I'm going to insert an ID, description, and name, and then I'm going to say values. And let's say let's say that's going to be 1. Let's say that the description is going to be product 1 description. And let's say the name is going to be product 1. Product 1. In order to execute this query, we can select it and we can do Alt Enter. And okay, not Alt Enter, Control Enter, and it's going to get executed. And now if we run the select query, select star from product, we should get our one product here. And yes, we do get our product right here. So let's see if the Spring application is going to be able to get our product. So if I refresh the page right now here, there we go, we're getting our product. So the ID is 1, the product name is 1, the description is product 1 description, and this is getting fetched via the database, via the repository layer, and we're using it in our controller, and we are returning it to the get mapping here. And as you can see down here, you can see that we are actually selecting the query. So we're actually doing a select from the database. If I clear the console here, and if I run this again, you're going to see that there's going to be a select to the database. There's one select where we get the data. So that's pretty interesting, and that's how it works. Of course, now we can add some more data, so we could add another one. Let's add another one with another ID. Let's say this one is going to be a product 2, and I just add it. So I'm going to do Control and Enter and add it. Now if I refresh here, I'm going to get that product added, and so on. We can. This is going to be this tutorial. You know, I just show you how you can very easily connect the Postgres database to your Spring Boot application. So that's how it works. That's pretty interesting. As you can see here, we are getting the SQL shown. And that's going to be it for this videos. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. And thanks for watching, and see you until the next time.